Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Miloš Majore, and I will be talking to my colleagues, Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter, about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the Weekly Forecast Monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The Weekly Forecast Monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Andrew, it's been a heavy week as always. Can you give us a rundown on some of the most important things you've been tracking this week?
So this week, the U.S. and Iran traded proposals for a diplomatic settlement to the war, with Pakistan working as a key intermediary. Meanwhile, the U.S. is sending an additional 2,000 troops at least to the region for a possible ground operation inside of Iran. And the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated that there was, quote, irrefutable evidence of Russian intelligence aid to Iran, while the United Kingdom authorized its armed forces to board and seize Russian shadow fleet vessels. Looking at the Indo-Pacific, a member of Japan's self-defense forces broke into the Chinese embassy in Tokyo as Japan plans to downgrade relations with China, while the White House confirmed new dates for a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The U.S., meanwhile, has formally stated it would deny access to a Russian tanker aiming to deliver oil to Cuba, while continuing to allow U.S. suppliers to sell oil to Cuba's private sector.
Right, so a lot to unpack there, as always. And let's stick, as we have done for the past couple of weeks, with starting with the Middle East. So you mentioned some seemingly mixed messages coming out of Iran there. So what can you update us on the diplomatic front there?
Yeah, a number of significant military updates as well. Of course, those are coming out at an hourly basis. But to really understand what's going on this week, we need to start on the diplomatic side of the house. So as we mentioned in the intro, Pakistan has emerged as a key diplomatic player right now, really leading as the key intermediary between Iran and the United States, managing indirect communication. Since that has happened, the U.S. has presented Iran with a 15-point ceasefire proposal. The details of that have not been made public or confirmed by the White House. However, there's a significant amount of reporting out there saying that the 15 points essentially center around Iran turning over its enriched uranium, the actual material that it has, ending the program for good, severe limitations on Iran's domestic ballistic missile production, and a complete cessation of aid and support to Iran's proxy network around the region. It goes without saying, of course, if you follow these events closely, that is essentially a non-starter for the Iranians. And indeed, they denied the proposal. The latest, however, is that they sent a counter proposal back to the United States, again, through Pakistan. There's been quite a deal of confusion, both on the U.S. and the Iranian side, about what the actual state of negotiations is. The latest that I saw is that the Iranians have confirmed that they are reviewing a new set of proposals from the United States. But then, of course, they also issued a number of statements saying that there will be no negotiations while the war itself is still ongoing. Another key point here is that Iranian officials are insisting that a ceasefire deal in Lebanon also has to be part of the package, or they won't agree to it. Almost certainly they're seeking to preserve Hezbollah as a viable political and military entity within Lebanon and as a threat to Israel to some extent. I haven't seen a response to that yet from U.S. officials. And then finally, the U.S. has paused attacks very specifically against Iran's energy facilities for a 5-day period, which is set to expire tomorrow, March 27th. And that's because Trump cited progress in what he is calling, the Iranians are denying this, but what he is calling negotiations with the Iranians. Again, that pause is set to expire tomorrow. At the same time, of course, U.S. and Israeli bombardment of essentially the rest of their targets that has continued unabated across the country.
Right. So, and I should note to our listeners that we are recording this on Thursday, the 26th. So we will likely update you on these diplomatic developments next week once we hear more results from the end of this pause. But as all of this has been going on, there's also been quite a lot of military developments, obviously. And you mentioned up top, amongst other things, that there could be another deployment of more US soldiers to the region. So could you give us an update on the situation on the military front as it stands right now?
So the latest is that the U.S. has ordered the deployment of at least 2,000 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East. I say the Middle East, obviously, as a general term, because we do not know exactly where they will begin that deployment, certainly not where they will end it, or their exact mission set. Now, I remind listeners that two MUs, Marine Expeditionary Units, are either en route or currently present in the AOR. Now, a number of points that could be made here. Trump is saying as of today that if the Iranians do not, quote, get serious about negotiations, there will be a severe escalation beyond what we have seen so far. Now, what that could look like, of course, is a U.S. Ground operation in Iran. If that does happen, we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But as far as listeners should be aware of, at this point, there's a lot of U.S. Ground firepower and assets in the region right now, right? Just simply by the numbers and capabilities. However, similar to what we were discussing about Venezuela a few months ago, just before the Maduro op, that is not an invasion force, right? That's not what the U.S. had lined up to push into Iraq from Kuwait at the start of the Iraq War, for example, right? Now, however, those forces, and especially these Marine Expeditionary Units, absolutely could seize Karg Island, for example, parts of the Iranian shoreline. There's quite a bit you could say there. But again, it's not an invasion force. If the U.S. did want to conduct, I say limited with caution because this would be a severe escalation, but limited ground options against Iranian islands or on the coast, doctrinally, these are the perfect forces to do that. And then, again, just as a final note there is always the possibility that the U.S. will order, in conjunction with that type of operation, U.S. special forces to seize enriched uranium inside of Iran itself.
Right. So hopefully by next week, we'll be able to brief listeners more on which route the US decided to take on this front. And then finally, just sticking to the Middle East here, you mentioned Lebanon up top. What can you tell us on the situation there?
So the situation in Lebanon continues to escalate essentially across all fronts. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has said that Israel intends to occupy all Lebanese territory south of the Litani River. That represents about 10% of the total territory inside of Lebanon. It goes without saying that's a severe escalation, even within the context of the last couple of weeks of Israeli operations inside of Lebanon. Israeli bombardment across the country and in Beirut itself has also been escalating. Hezbollah has continued to fire rockets into Israeli territory, of course, especially in the north, some rockets reaching into central Israel as well. Hezbollah is saying that they absolutely will not negotiate whatsoever while the war is ongoing. They equated that to surrender. Israeli ground operations also have intensified. They have not yet And again, this could change within the hour, realistically. But as we're recording, they have not yet started a very aggressive, rapid invasion that you would expect to see for such an aggressive military objective. But again, that could change on short notice.
Right. Thank you, Andrew, for that report on the Middle East. And now we wanted to turn to our second hotspot, which would be the Indo-Pacific. So turning back to you here, Jared. There's been a few developments across the region, and let's just start by getting a quick update on the situation with US and China, which, as we know, last week, the summit that was initially scheduled for the end of March between Trump and Xi had been postponed. So are there any updates on that front?
Yeah, thanks, Milos. Yeah, there has been several updates. The first major one is that it has been rescheduled for May 14th to the 15th. And the primary reason for these reschedulings, of course, is going to be the Iran war dividing much of the American administration's attention. They requested an official delaying, and Beijing has granted that. It's also seen an interesting development coming from the Chinese premier, Li Qiang, who's announced that the Chinese Development Forum in Beijing, he announced a few days ago, that they're going to be shifting Chinese interests and their trade interests more toward import duties and import of higher quality goods from the US and the EU. This is something that we're seeing as a systemic shift over time. It's gradual, but it's extremely important. China is very much an export-driven economy. And that's where most of their primary revenue comes from. And China is kind of realizing how weak and vulnerable these type of trade lanes can be, particularly with what's going on in the Middle East right now. So they are trying to diversify their economy so that there's ever any type of conflict, or even potentially this could be a preparation for some type of expected economic cutoff in the event of a Taiwanese incursion. They're trying to make sure that their economy is diversified enough that they can be able to operate in more than just a sole export sector.
Right, and presumably that statement of opening the economy in this time where we're expecting that summit could be a sort of way to lay the groundwork for those negotiations taking place, maybe as a gesture of some kind to the United States. But in the meantime, we have also been seeing a continuation of escalations between China and Japan, which has been in the making for the past couple of months. So what has been the development this week, Jared?
So this week, Japan is expected to downgrade its relationship with China in its upcoming 2026 diplomatic handbook report. And the primary reason for this is the new administration under Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. She has been very war hawkish in her rhetoric. She has promised and followed through with kind of separating Japan a little bit more from China, kind of trying to build a better, more entrenched security relationship with the United States and other partners. Japan right now, under this current administration, which they have a very popular mandate. They won in one of the largest electoral landslides in Japanese history. They're trying to pull Japan into more of a nationalistic narrative. Takaichi has often compared herself to Margaret Thatcher in her belief systems. So we're likely to see a kind of right-wing, more nationalistic and security-minded shift in Japanese politics, particularly adopting a more antagonistic view toward China. She's also recently, of course, made comments talking about desiring to defend Taiwan in the event of Chinese incursions. So we're definitely seeing an escalation in the rhetoric in East Asia.
Right, thanks, Jared. And I should mention that this happened on the heels of an unrelated event, but there's been a lot of diplomatic sparring concerning a Japanese active duty military officer who reportedly tried to break into the Chinese embassy in Tokyo. Now, should be said that obviously the Japanese government has distanced itself from the event, but that hasn't stopped Beijing from demanding a severe investigation and possible punishment into the person involved. And so whether that starts spiraling is something that we're going to be keeping an eye on as well over the next week or so. And then finally, in the Indo-Pacific, just wanted to get a sense on the situation in Taiwan and specifically related to China as we're tracking its increasing military capabilities in the region. So what can you update us there, Jared?
Yeah, in both Taiwan and China, there's been interesting security developments. On the Chinese side, we've started to see Chinese conduct large and extensive undersea mapping and monitoring. Part of this is, of course, a lot of this is being said under the guise of scientific research. However, many security analysts have been saying that this, of course, partially is in response to potential, looking for undersea undersea security weaknesses inside of Taiwanese waters, being able to see where they would be most vulnerable to an undersea attack, particularly for like strategic submarines or potentially drones. And part of this is also in response to Taiwan's large push in the wake of the Ukraine war to develop a large swarm drone fleet that could be able to effectively counter the Chinese Navy. And much of this underwater activity is expected to be kind of a part of China's attempts to counter that evolving security relationship there. As far as like China's current military activity, they've been conducting large-scale patrols. At this point, these type of patrols have been very common. They've been occurring literally almost daily. However, one thing that we're starting to notice, again, this is in response to the drone warfare kind of craze that's been taking the world here, is we've been kind of seeing, I've been noticing in a lot of my research that we've been seeing a shift in from just Chinese military patrols, just these kind of aircraft patrols, into more like systemic blockade duties. What this is kind of signifying to me is that China is more or less kind of giving up on the idea that a large-scale invasion is something that they would ever really meaningfully consider, that a blockade is becoming like very much so the preferred option of Beijing. If it were to come to that, of course, that would not be Beijing's preferred outcome, but that would definitely, if hostilities were to occur, that would probably be the more likely way it would occur there. As far as the Taiwanese side of things, Taiwanese Defense Minister Wellington Koo has received a guarantee from the U.S. that the U.S. is definitely planning to approve its $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan. It's looking like the United States is definitely going to be approving that. It looks like it has relatively strong bipartisan support. This actually gets into another problem the U.S. has actually been having. The U.S. is trying to get Taiwan to buy more military equipment right now. And of course, very famously, the Taiwanese legislature is still continued to be gridlocked between the more pro-Chinese or pro-security minded KMT wanting to have a lower defense budget. These fights in the legislative yuan are still continuing, and they've proposed and passed limited emergency military defense budgets to be able to buy very specific things that they need, not only because they need it, but also they wish to maintain a good security relationship with the U.S. But that fight is continuing, and the U.S. lawmakers are continuing to push very hard for Taiwan to be able to purchase these weapons at the schedule produced. The U.S. is very desperate for this, of course, because maintaining like forward deployment positions of these weapons that they're planning to sell is very expensive. They need to kind of get them out as along the schedule that they planned out. So that's very important for the Taiwanese-American security relationship. In terms of domestic Taiwanese politics, something very interesting in their security relationship has been developing. President Lai Ching-te has just announced that they are planning to begin a reactivation process of the island's nuclear plants. Now, they've been off for decades. This is not a routine type of thing. It takes years to be able to bring them back up to full power. It takes a lot of effort to be able to modernize them because, of course, they've been off for a very long time. A lot of work would need to be done. But the main point about what we're seeing here is that Taiwan has actually been very honest about the reason that they're wanting to do this is because they view a potential blockade as a death nail to them because they have a very limited supply of domestic energy reserves. They need to be able to have some type of ability to produce their own power because they just don't have a lot of domestic energy reserves. If they get cut off, nuclear power is pretty much their only option. And President Lai Ching-te has presented this as a security guarantee for Taiwan, a way to keep it safe. Now, of course, China has accused Taiwan of this reactivation potentially being the start of a budding nuclear weapons program. There's very little evidence to suggest that that would ever be the intention of the Taiwanese state. But regardless, of course, this is a very controversial opinion, both internationally and domestically, because of course there's many people in Taiwan that are very green energy minded. They have a very relatively progressive energy agenda. Lai Ching-te has stressed very hard that this is not going to interfere with that. However, there's a lot of domestic pushback as well as international pushback to this new plan, and that's kind of what we've been seeing sort of in the Indo-Pacific right now.
Got it. Thanks, Jared. So yeah, lots of moving pieces that it will be interesting to see whether that shows up in the upcoming summit between Trump and Xi, assuming that doesn't get postponed again. And then finally, just bringing it back to you, Andrew, on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So we've been seeing a bit more diplomatic activity than we have done in some of the past few weeks. So what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, so the Diplomatic efforts being led by the U.S. have essentially completely stalled since the start of the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran. There was quite a significant amount of activity in the year leading up to that, really, but especially in those last few weeks before the start of this war. And then this last weekend, over March 21st to the 22nd, there was the first meeting in a month in Miami between senior U.S. and Ukrainian representatives. Following that two-day summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that the U.S. has conditioned security guarantees to Ukraine on Kyiv's willingness to cede the entirety of the Donbass region. Now, again, this might feel like a long time ago, but a month ago, before the start of the U.S. war in the Middle East, security guarantees were the talk of the diplomatic effort. There was the most recent headline was that the Ukrainians had a set of proposals that had gone back and forth between Washington and Kyiv a number of times, that they were confident they had something that they were ready to present to the White House and for Trump to approve. Of course, the war in the Middle East has changed all that in significant ways. And on that note, Zelenskyy has claimed that Ukraine has, quote, irrefutable evidence that Russia is providing Iran with intelligence in its war effort to target U.S. forces in the Middle East. I will note that there has been a similar statement as of today from the European Union, essentially saying the same thing. There's also a lot of reporting out there right now that Russia is providing drones to Iran. I haven't seen the Russians have denied that, of course. I haven't seen a statement on that from the White House yet. I suspect that we will shortly. But again, quite a significant amount of hybrid escalation from Russia directly in the U.S.-Israeli war in the Middle East. At the same time, Ukraine has kept up its campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. A series of Ukrainian drone strikes forced Russia to halt oil exports from two major ports on the Baltic Sea. At the same time, or not the same time, but also this week, I should say, a Turkish crewed vessel operating in the Black Sea under a vessel with the flag of Sierra Leone was hit by a drone while transporting Russian oil on March 26. Now, the Ukrainians have been escalating both the geographic scope of their campaign against Russian oil exports, as well as the frequency with which those attacks take place. Purely from an operational perspective, the Ukrainians are good at carrying out that kind of attack, and I suspect that we will continue to see that sort of escalation in the short to medium term future. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also escalating things on the hybrid front, specifically against Russia's shadow fleet. And again, the shadow fleet refers to the fleet, the global fleet, essentially, of ships that Russia uses to evade U.S. and international sanctions against its energy exports. Starmer has authorized the British Armed Forces to board and seize Russian shadow fleet vessels. That is meaningful. That is, I would say, a significant escalation against the shadow fleet and against sanctions evasion. However, this is being done in response to the U.S. easing sanctions against Russia, specifically against Russian oil exports. So it will be interesting to see if other European nations follow suit and become a little bit more aggressive now that the British are doing so. And then inside of Ukraine itself, there was an IED explosion on March 23rd in the city of Bucha, very close to Kyiv, that injured two Ukrainian police officers. Ukraine, of course, has attributed this attack to Russian intelligence agents, the FSB, who recruited individuals in the area. Again, I think we can expect to see more escalation of this sort as peace efforts essentially remain stalled, despite recent updates from this past weekend. And then, of course, I just want to note that while there has been more diplomatic news than there has been in the last few weeks, and while there is significant hybrid escalation this week, the war continues on the front line in full force. Ukrainian officials are claiming that Russia has initiated a springtime ground offensive basically across the entire front. The Kremlin has not issued an official statement saying that this is what Ukrainian forces and the defense ministry are reporting. At the same time, Russia continues its regular bombardment of Ukrainian cities and against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. In fact, just a couple of days ago was the largest 24-hour drone attack by Russia into Ukraine of the war so far.
Understood. So thank you for all of those updates, Andrew. And we'll have to wrap it up soon. But before we do, Jared, turning back to you, are there any quick updates from other hotspots that you can brief us on?
Yeah, one of the most important that we've been seeing recently is the recent American activity with Cuba. A Russian oil tanker, as for quite some time now, has been heading towards Cuba with about 700,000 barrels of crude oil, and the United States has formally stated that it will not be permitted to dock and deliver its contents. Now, the Cuban energy grid has basically collapsed at this point. It has caused widespread discontent and a lot of damage to the island. The United States has been permitting smaller quantities of oil deliveries to arrive in Cuba, but only to Cuba's private sector. Now, of course, the intention of this is very obvious, that the United States wants to be able to foment a sort of private sector dependency on the economy, to try and pull power away from the centralized communist government, to try to foment this type of market revolution and a widespread discontent from the people. The obvious and even stated intention is that they want the Cuban government to become very disliked, so that they can eventually see like an internal uprising and a more U.S.-friendly and market-friendly regime take power. This, of course, has been a long-stated goal of the current Secretary of the State, Marco Rubio. He has both a personal and an ideological connection to this. He has talked about it at length. So we're definitely seeing that manifest right now within Cuba. The next major hotspot, the kind of the last thing we'll touch on here, is there was an attack, a very severe one in Sudan, where 64 people were killed at a hospital in the country's Darfur region, where we've seen most of the violence be committed here. The Rapid Response Forces, or the rebel ISF, as they've been called, have blamed the Sudanese armed forces for the strike. They have claimed that they were the ones who conducted the strike. The Sudanese armed forces, of course, denied the attack. But of course, in this war, denials of atrocities are basically par for the course. Every side has been committing widespread atrocities, and they've equally been denying responsibility or blaming each other for each of them. There's been many false flag attacks. There's been many attacks that often just go unreported. So this is yet another example of a very severe violence that is continuing to unfold in Sudan, very unfortunately. The conflict so far is now entering its third year, with a official death count of around 40,000 people. So this is one of the most deadly wars going on in the world today.
Right, understood. Thank you, Jared. So we'll have to leave it there for today's podcast. And to our listeners, if you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all the topics we covered today, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org. There you will also be able to register to receive our weekly newsletter, as well as access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, everyone.